Shalom. My name is Rabbi Yitzchok Raskin. I represent the Chabad Lubavitch organization and the rabbi here in Burlington, Vermont. We're going to start a series of Torah thoughts on the weekly portion. We're going to start with the beginning of Genesis. But first, there's an interesting story that goes this way. There was once a convention of scientists, and they were all discussing how wonderful it is, the advantages and that science had reached. Till one of them had suggested that maybe we don't need God anymore. Maybe you could go on vacation because we're doing such a wonderful job. And after a long discussion, they all agreed that we're managing fine. We reached the age we could clone things. We could do everything that we need. We don't need God. So they decided to send a message and to let know God that he could go on vacation. So they elected a few scientists, and they took on themselves the mission to travel up there in heaven and to meet up with God. And they came, had an appointment, came and saw God, and they informed him that is very good news. You did a wonderful job, you created a world, but now we don't need you anymore. So God says, really, you don't need me anymore? He says, yeah, we could do everything that you're doing, we could do the same. We could create human beings. So God says, fine. But a very important thing, it has to be the same way that I did, where I had nothing. The same way is with you guys. You should have nothing when you start creating the world. I'll take everything back and you could start. So they said, no problem. And we could do a human being. So one of them says, we'll go and just get dirt. So the God says, no. Dirt also not. Nothing. The same way as it was when I created the human being. So this is where we find ourselves in the beginning of the discussion here of Bereishit. We're going to talk about the first verse in the 5 books of Moses, known as the Bible, the Tanakh, and in Hebrew it's also known as the word Torah. Torah in Hebrew is from the word instruction, because really the whole idea of the teaching, the idea of Torah is the message of instruction. This is what it's all about. So it's not just a history book of stories, but every word here is a message of life. That's something that we could take for ourselves and learn from it day by day. So that's why in Hebrew the word Torah, what is known by everyone when they say the Torah portion, we're going to learn Torah. The word of Torah is instruction. And with that we're going to go to the first verse. So I have here, so the first verse that in Hebrew it says, Bereishit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God had created heaven and earth. So we're going to concentrate on the first words. Bereishit, in the beginning, bara, created, Elokim, God. So the first thing is Bereishit, in the beginning. This is something very important, because the first word here in the Torah tells us beginning, means there was a beginning. Something maybe that in our story that we began about the scientists, that they missed out a very important point, that there was a beginning. And in a way, that beginning is something that continues still even in our days. In everything that we do, a lot of times we come to a situation and we see that everything is ready and everything is prepared, and we don't realize the work that went in behind the scene. And this is something that's very important. In many things like this in life, you come in to a store and everything looks beautiful, everything looks nice, the people are selling, the merchandise is in its place, but we don't realize there was a lot of preparation going into behind all this. The same way that I'm sitting and talking here, maybe some don't realize there was a lot of preparation going into this. So everything has a beginning, and that beginning is very important, because that beginning is also, in a way, the purpose. In other words, because when we know where we're heading, what's the idea, then it is there's much more success here. So in this beginning that we're talking about, this is important to understand. Bereishit, in the beginning, this is trying to tell something. So in other words, there was a time where there was nothing. And then all of a sudden, there was something. So that's giving us a very important message here, that God created this world out of nothing. So we have to imagine this, because it's very hard for us to understand when we see a world in front of us. We have to understand that a situation where there was nothing there. There was no world, not even the dirt to create the human being. There was nothing there. Who existed? Only one entity existed, and that was God. And then comes the next situation where God had created. In Hebrew, and this is what becomes very important, the next word in this verse is bara. Bara means created. And that alludes to this idea, as our sages, the commentators, explain this verse. The word in Hebrew, bara, to create, brings out this point. To create something out of nothing. There's many expressions in the Torah, in the Bible, that talk about different situations. God made, God spoke. We see, for example, later on in this first chapter, when speaking about the different things that God had created, the word that's being used, it says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So it's using the word God spoke. He spoke, and there was a world. But here, in the first verse, he introduces everything with the idea created. Because this idea of created means that everything came from nothing. And that's a very important thing that we have to realize. A lot of times for ourselves, we think we know it all, and we could do everything with our own understanding and the way we think we should do it. So we have to realize that there is a beginning, and when we follow that beginning, that's how things are going to be successful. So we continue. So the next thing it says, we said in the beginning, bara, created. Who's the one that created? Elokim. Elokim, this is the word in Hebrew here, for God. Now we find in the Torah different ways how God is described. When we want to talk about God, when he's talking about creating miracles, there's a name, how God is being described. When we talk here about Elokim, this word is associated more with nature. When God created a natural world. And that's important to understand. In other words, what God has done, he created a natural world. And it's such a natural world till to the point that there's some individuals in the world that we live that may say that there's no God. In other words, God is such a genius. He created such a world that even allows individuals to think that there's no God. And that's something that only God himself was able to do. From time to time, there's clear situations where we could say we have no choice but to say to ourselves this happened by God. This is the hand of God, a miracle. So some of us will try to explain every miracle and say, this is also according to nature. And sometimes we get stuck and we have no choice to say, well, this is something that happened by God. But in generally speaking, what God has done, He had created a natural world. The sun sets, the sun rises, there's stars, there's an earth, there's water, and there's all these things for us human beings to be able to do, to the point that He gave us the tools. So in other words, He gave us the beginning. He's there behind the scene all the time. And for us, it's many times we have to kind of look and think and realize that in every step of the way, God is there, but He's not in such a revealed way. So in Hebrew, when we want to describe the God of nature, as we would call Him here, is not that there is, God forbid, many gods, but you could describe the God of miracles when He does miracles. But in the Torah, for example, you see many times we describe the kind one, the strong one, many different applications the way we describe God. But here, in this first chapter, he talks about Elohim. So I want to show you something very interesting. So this is the word Elohim. Elohim, so we have this in Hebrew, the alphabet also have a numerical equivalent to them. Letter Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet, is equals to 1. The second letter equals to 2. So in other words, the letters of the alphabet also are numbers. We not necessarily see that A, B, C. A is not necessarily 1 or B is 2, but in Hebrew, the alphabet, Aleph is 1, Bet is 2. So Elohim is put together from an Aleph, a Lamed, and a Hey, and a Yud, and a Mem. The Aleph is 1, the Lamed is 30, and the Hey is 5, the Yud is 10, and the Mem is 40. That equals to 86. Let's have this in our mind, that the numerical equivalent of the word Elohim is 86. Now we find something very interesting, and that is in Hebrew. The word, the nature, is HaTeva. In Hebrew, Teva is the nature, HaTeva, the nature. Now, if you look very carefully, the Hey is 5, Tet is 9, Bet is 2, the Ein is 70, it equals to 86. So that's exactly what Elohim is. So HaTeva and Elohim both equal to 86. So that's very interesting because it matches the idea. The nature that God created, that is from the name of Elohim. So that is Bereishit, bara Elohim. In the beginning, Elohim, the idea of nature, God had created a natural world. And this is specifically, God did everything on purpose, that it should be in such a way that gives us room to grow, room to understand, and room that each one of us could understand what our mission is and be able to fulfill what our purpose is. But only if we realize that everything has a beginning. When we realize that everything has a beginning, that allows us, then I'm here to, not necessarily to finish the job, but at least to move it along. And with that, I come to a very interesting thing, to the first letter of the verse here. That this is Bereishit, begins with letter Bet. Now the alphabet, the first letter of the alphabet is the Aleph. Now, God could have, when he dictated here the Torah to Moses, he could have done that the first letter of the Torah should have been with an aleph. And it would have been very easy. It would have been with the word Elokim. The word Elokim begins with an aleph. So it could have been God had created in the beginning. And it starts over here. In the beginning, God had created. The word in the beginning, God had created. The beginning begins with the letter Bet. Now, interesting enough, later on, and this is a very another interesting point, 26 generations after the creation of the world, that's when it was the revelation at Mount Sinai. And at the revelation at Mount Sinai, when God introduced the Ten Commandments, the first of the Ten Commandments is, I am God that took you out from Egypt. In Hebrew, the first letter, the first word of the Ten Commandments is Anochi. I am. Anochi. I am. The word Anochi, I am, is with the letter Aleph. So we see that the Ten Commandments begin with the letter Aleph, but here it begins with the letter Bet. By the way, there's a very interesting story about the word Anochi. The word Anochi means I am. So there's a story. There was one of the great Hasidic masters that was the Mezritcher Maggid. And he used to try to teach his students humility, the love of God. So he had one of his disciples that was a great scholar, but he had a little problem. And the problem was that he didn't know much about being humble. It happens sometimes to great scholars that they know a lot, and sometimes they forget that also part of the idea of teaching is also you have to be sometimes a little bit humble. So the Mezritcher Maggid decided to help him out. So he says, I have a great student a few miles away. His name was Rabbi Aaron of Karlin. When you travel to your town, why don't you stop at Karlin and say hello to my student? It happens to be, he arrived in Karlin, it was the middle of the night. He went to town to look for the house of Rabbi Aaron. In the beginning, he was having a hard time to find it, but then he saw a light in one of the houses, so he realized that must be the Rabbi Aaron, that he's up at night by candles in those times, sitting and learning. So he comes and approaches the house, and he goes to the door, he knocks on the door. So he hears a question. Who's there? This visitor answered, it's me. In Hebrew, he said, Anochi, it's I. So the rabbi just ignored him. Rabbi Aaron just ignored him, continued learning. A few minutes later, he's knocking again. Who's there? So he says, it's I, it's me. He didn't answer him. Finally, after a while, he opened for him the door. So he says, why didn't you answer the door for me? He says, well, when someone says, it's me, the only one that says me, it's God. And you could use the window too. You don't have to use you don't have to come out. You don't need a door. God could enter anyway. He goes in. So you got the message. So you learned a little bit about humility. Anyways, we're back to our verse over here. So the question is, why did the Torah begin with letter Bet? So there's a few interesting explanations. And one of them is that the secret of success of studying Torah is to always remember that we are number two. We are Bet. Number one is God. So when we sit down to study, what happens to us a lot of times when we study, we sometimes get lost and try to create our own imagination and almost create a new religion because we think that we know it. So we have to realize we are bet. We are number 2. We are here to try to understand what God has put in front of us. That's the number 2. That's the bet. So there's a deeper meaning with this idea that the Torah began with number 2. And interesting enough, in Hebrew, the word bet, that has different words that begins with bet, one of them that we say every day is Baruch. When we make a blessing, before we drink water, before we eat, before we do any mitzvah, we make a blessing. It begins, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you God. Blessing in Hebrew, beracha, begins with the letter bet. So it's interesting. So we want blessing. We want a blessing. Remember bet. Remember we are a bet. And now there's another interesting idea in the bet, that if we look on letter bet, and in this one here, maybe we could see, this is a letter bet, so it has 3 sides to it. One side is open. So there's a little bit of a hint here. God is saying, I created a world, but I know not everything is perfect. But the reason why not everything is perfect, because I left a little bit for the individuals, for the creatures down here in the world, to try to help me out. And this becomes our task, to become a partner in creation. There's a famous statement in the Talmud that says that when we do wonderful things, it's not only that we fulfill the wishes of the Almighty, it will also we gain a task that we become partners in creation. So it's not only if we don't mess up, that we all hope every day that we don't mess up, but more than that, when we do something positive, we are helping God in His creation. So it's an amazing thing. God has probably done 99.9, but He's living 1 point for us, and with that, it's going to be 100%. But, as mentioned many times, this is an amazing thing. So God took 6 days to create a world, and we are trying for the last who knows how many years just to get that little percentage fixed, and we're still struggling with it to get it right. So that for sure helps us for humility a little bit. So, or like God turned to the scientists and said, you have to start everything from scratch. No dirt, nothing. Start everything from scratch. But at least to us, He says, you have a world in front of you. I created everything. Everything is there. Just get it right. And this is what we're working to keep on doing. And we should always be successful in doing the right thing. And that will help us, that we should be able to connect from being number 2 to connect with the One, with the Almighty. And that will bring blessings for us in our day-by-day life. Thank you.